Tonight we're going to talk about communication and how to express your needs. And we're going to be intentional, and I'm hopefully going to be able to facilitate some good questions, and you guys will be able to actually help to facilitate some good discussion around this. And if we don't have a lot of great participation, then of course I have just information, education I can share, but you guys are always so great about participating. So we're going to move on to our next slide. I just want to take a moment and thank our sponsors for tonight's event. This mental wellness chat has been going on for a good bit now since COVID, and we've seen that it's been very helpful and beneficial to people. It's been connecting, and we've seen the attendance grow, and it's been a great thing. So I want to thank Novartis and Bristol Myers Squibb for their great sponsorship of this program. Their continued sponsorship was incredible. And then also thank MSGs and News, because without them, this MS Mental Wellness Chat would not be happening. So they were the people that started this for us. Actually, before we get started, so we're going to leave that slide right there. You are not alone. And I say this often in the program because this is important to know. Often we feel like what we're going through, that we can feel isolated or feel disconnected from others. We may feel like our challenges are nobody else would understand them, either based on disease or life circumstances, etc. But I do want to give you some reassurance that in this community, you are not alone. We're going to talk a little bit about communication and challenges centered around communication and MS. We're going to talk a little bit about different communication needs versus different settings, because there are different ways that we communicate differently. We're going to talk a little bit about just types of communication and some tools to improve communication. And really, this is your mental wellness chat, and so your tools, your resources. So if there's questions that you have that when we're going along, feel free to ask. So this is a repeat slide. I throw in these sometimes into the presentation, not because I have lack of material. Mental wellness, we have a lot of material, but I want to reiterate points. So self-care requires checking in with yourself and asking yourself how you're doing and what your body's asking for. We're going to be talking a little bit about communication, and we're going to talk about general communication and communication related to MS. And so in order to be able to communicate what we need, we have to know what we need, right? And so I'm just going to reiterate the point that self-care is so incredibly important. And it just does require us to kind of check in and figure out how we're doing and kind of see what our bodies need. And with MS, our bodies tell us often what we need. It might, I know for me, I worked a full day, and this evening before tonight's program, I checked in with myself, and my body said I needed to rest. So I closed my eyes for about close to an hour before tonight's program. So, but that's an act of self-care, checking in, seeing what your body needs, and seeing how you're doing. So we'll move on to the next slide. So the role of communication in MS, when I think about, and I'm going to ask you guys a question, even though I don't have a question box here in a second. And we have David from Nashville that just signed on. Hi, David. So the role of communication in MS, I think that communication is incredibly important for every single person, and probably no matter what disease. But I think that communication is extremely important when you're living with an invisible disease, because not everyone can tell how you're feeling, what's going on with you, what your needs are, etc. So some of these communication tips are going to be transferable to anybody, regardless of MS. But MS does give us some special considerations with communication, and a special opportunity to look at communication and say, you know what, I need to work on this. The other thing I was thinking about the role of MS in communication is how sometimes MS can kind of interrupt communication. And my question will follow this in a second. But do you ever notice that your MS create some challenges with communication. And I'll get us started. And we've got Bridget here. Hi, Bridget. It's good to see you. So I'll get us started with this. MS absolutely can cause problems in communication for me in a couple ways. And so I'm going to give you my example. And I want you to see if you guys have examples. And if you don't, that's great. But I know that we're not alone and that people do deal with these challenges too. Not everyone, possibly. But I would say that one of the challenges that I can experience with communication is with fatigue and experiencing cognitive fatigue. And so in those cases where I might be experiencing fatigue and cognitive fatigue, I might not be able to communicate quite as sharply as I would want to, and that can be very frustrating because I might not be able to come up with the words that I want to say, or might not be thinking as fluidly as I normally would. So that's a way that MS impacts my ability to communicate, because I might not be able to express what I want to say as easily. Another way that MS may halt my communication, and I've seen this with patients that I work with when I've worked in the mental health setting, is it can change your mood sometimes. And when our moods feel different, that changes the way we communicate. So I want you to think about that for a second. Like, if you're feeling good or having a good day, you might communicate differently versus if you're not feeling as good, if your mood is lower. Or if you're overly fatigued, you might not communicate as well. Or if you're like me and when you get fatigued, you can have a little bit of cognitive fatigue, you may not communicate as the same either. So MS does change a little bit in how we communicate. So we have Maddie here that says, yes, I can lose my train of thought if I get interrupted or if people are talking over each other. Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely something very, very common that can happen, is that we can lose our train of thought or our attention, right? Also, we've got Lydia. I'm here for the first time. Lydia, thank you for coming and signing on. She's from New York City, and we are so glad that you're here. Do not apologize for being late. I am glad that you made it. And Dion said cognitive fatigue is an excellent description. And then Linda says, I must have eye contact in order to focus on someone, on what someone is saying. So you have to really fully attend to something and really pay attention. And so we can see that, we might have to, with MS, you might have some challenges that you have to make accommodations for with communication, just in general. And I can definitely say that it's very common sometimes to easily be distracted, or to, I'm trying to think of the example, or if other things are getting in the way in terms of noise, that you have to really focus in on the person that you're talking to. Okay, we're going to move on to our next slide here. So MS changes over time, and it varies over time. So, you may have relapsing MS, or you may have progressive MS. You may see that, well, gosh, a couple years ago, your changes may be slight or subtle, or they may be pretty significant and different. But MS does tend to change over time, and for me, I know it's a lot of subtle changes, small changes with energy and things like that. But when your MS changes, that also means that that your communication needs will change too. I'm going to answer a question real quick. We have somebody that she asked, or they asked, how does one type into a chat for answers to be seen? And so this is one of the things about the mental wellness chat that's very unique in this platform. And again, I am not responsible for it. It's what we've been using, and it's worked pretty well. But you can type something in the question box, and I can see it, and I will assure you that that I will look at it and I will read it, and I will make space for it. And if it's not a good fit for tonight's program, I'll even note that. And if you don't want your name to be shared while I'm reading, then just say, don't say my name. But we cannot see the responses or the what other people put in the chat box. It's just been, this format's been this way the whole time. So I just wanted you to know, because I just wanted you to know. So please feel free to ask questions, and know that I will give everybody space for their question to be heard, because everyone on this call matters to me. So MS changes over time, and that means that your communication might change over time. You may need some support that you now that you didn't need a long time ago. You may need different things, and so we have to figure out, how can we ask for support when we need it, and how often how can we make sure that we are expressing our needs as we are experiencing them. To have someone that says, I sometimes become overly emotional to the point of tears, and I just don't know why, and I have to turn away and gather myself, and it makes communicating tough. That absolutely could be, it sounds like a very challenging experience, that, if you're feeling like you're trying to communicate and then you get, either very emotional or frustrated, or you have a response to that leads you to feel, teary. What I'm, going to say there is that if anyone on this call has ever had an experience like that, please feel free to chime in and let Linda know that this is this happens sometimes. But sometimes too, it can be contributors to communication, and I'm going to talk about this later, can be if your mood is already altered, or if you are exhausted or tired, you might not have as much resilience in the communication. Or it may be the topic that is creating the emotional response. And sometimes there is, and I'm going to mention this just to mention it because it's important enough. There is a symptom that some people, it's very rare with MS, but they can have pseudobulbar affect. And pseudobulbar affect sometimes can cause, it's like spontaneous crying or laughing. But mostly it will feel like very exaggerated, or almost, you'll feel like it's almost inappropriate. And there's like a lack of control with that. And that may not be exactly what's happening at all, but I just do want to ethically kind of to mention that happens, but it's very rare. So we have Julie here that says, I have that all the time. And then Linda says, when I walk away and regroup, I can come back and try again. And that, I think, is a really perfect accommodation for yourself. And it's okay that, sometimes in communication, we can get to a certain point where we need to maybe kind of take a pause, right? And taking a pause is okay. You get permission for yourself to take a pause and regroup and come back. And that actually makes you a better communicator and more in control of your emotions. And then we have Jane, who says, my husband has started wearing earbuds and she feels shut out. I told him, so the little difference in using them. Yeah, and so I could see that as well too. I don't know if you guys have people in your lives at home that wear earbuds, or even out in the community, or even in the airport last night. People just tend to have their earbuds in, and it leads to like a little bit less of a connection. And so that, that's really, I think that's great that, Jane, that you talked with your husband about it and you kind of shared how that made you feel, because it's important to kind of share those things, because he might need those earbuds, to participate and do the things that he wants to do, but at the same time you feel shut out, and it's kind of negotiating and discussing those things. Often communication can be centered around things that are challenging to talk about. And it's so important to make space for communication, because if you don't talk about the things that matter, they don't get discussed. I have another question here. Terry, I'm gonna save your question for just a little bit longer. I'm gonna make a note of it because I'm not gonna lose your question. I wanna get through a little bit more material, but your question is important to me, and I actually feel like it will be a great segue in a couple slides, okay? Why is it hard to ask for help with chronic disease, or why is it hard to, having MS, do you ever experience any challenges communicating some of your needs? So that will be a question. It's not a question box question, but I want you to put any responses in. So with having MS, do you struggle at all, or do you have challenges with communicating some of your needs? What I'll say is I'll get us started. So with my MS, sometimes I have a hard time communicating my fatigue and my symptoms because people think they see me in one light, and so if I'm tired or I need to change a plan or something like that, sometimes it can throw people off. So I struggle with communicating that sometimes. I do communicate it, but I struggle. How about you? Is there any symptoms that you struggle with, or any part of your MS that you have a hard time explaining or communicating? Or is there anything that you struggle with asking for help with? So we have Linda says, I struggle with asking for a ride when it's hot outside. And thank you for, and then Samadhi says, it's hard for me because I was raised to just get on and go with it. And being tired was never an excuse for doing work. It's so destructive. That is a point in therapy, I can tell you, that would come up a lot. And you are not alone in that, where people had values that were kind of instilled in them that being tired was a sign of weakness, or not, and so that it became ingrained that that's the way you're supposed to keep going and doing. But then with MS, that's not what you're supposed to do. And then it was hard because family members didn't understand. We have Wanda who says, I feel like I'm bothering others to ask for help, but I also want to be independent. Oh, I love this, Wanda. She says, my husband tells me there is being brave or dangerous. So the reason why I like this, so she said that she's fallen some. So that's the dangerous part. That's not what I like. But I think that there is like this balance of brave or dangerous, right? I think those two words I thought are interesting together, but I kind of like them. And the reason why is because sometimes asking for help is safe, right? And not asking for help is dangerous. And asking for help is brave, because it's kind of uncomfortable, but it also keeps us safe. And I thank you for sharing, Wanda. We have Kanita who says, I don't want people to think of me as helpless. And so that's definitely something that sometimes we can assume that people are thinking things like that of us. Maria said, I made a point of learning to eat with my right hand, so I needed little help of maneuvering my food. So she found an accommodation instead of, which is fine too, and instead of having to communicate it. Samita said, maybe it's hard with many MS or women who are often taught to take care and support, and so we don't reach out. And I do think a lot of people, are kind of brought up that they, they're the caretakers, or they're the and men with MS that I've worked with, often feel responsible for, taking care of things too, and so sometimes that can get in the way of asking for help. And Maria, I'm sorry, she said she's right-handed, so she's been using her left hand. Lorraine says, let's see, we're going to go back to Maria, said, I learned to eat with my left hand. And then we have someone here, and this is important to note, Samita says, I have serious noise sensitivity, and I wear noise-canceling headphones at work. And so to give the other person perception, so sometimes her work team says that she's accused of being isolated from them. And so she really appreciated the advice on that. Thank you, thank you. And then we also have one more. I lose my voice and I'm unable to communicate. So that can be a very big challenge. So that literally is a challenge with MS, and it can be more of a rare challenge, but sometimes it can impact your ability to functionally be able to talk. Or and then Rhonda says, I find it best when a thought, when she writes a thought on a note on her cell phone to read, and then rereads and then acts. So she processes it first. She puts her thought into the phone, very smart, and then goes back, rereads it, and kind of thinks about it. And that's creating a pause before communicating. And that is beneficial as well. So these are all really a mix of good strategies and also good sharing. So thank you. We're going to move on to the next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about some different communication strategies. We're going to go to the next slide. So step one is identifying your needs, because if you don't know what you need, or if you don't know what you want to communicate, then there's really no, I mean, it's too challenging. Like, if you don't know what you need, how is someone else going to know what you need? And if you don't know what you communicate, then how are you supposed to communicate it? So, and that's hard, because sometimes we can sit in a space where we kind of hold what we might not really know exactly what we need or exactly what we feel yet. We have to kind of work through that and identify it before we can ask for support. So we're gonna, and I'll just say the power, there is great power in knowing and understanding your needs. I'm gonna move on to our next slide. So there's different types of communication, and there's written, there's verbal, there's nonverbal, there's body language, etc. But I just wanted to highlight that the two I'll probably focus on more are, the written and the verbal. And so the verbal communication, is when we speak and share. But sometimes written communication can be very beneficial. And so I want to, as a therapist, being a therapist in my background, I want to share a little bit about written communication. So I think sometimes we might have some trouble being able to express how we're feeling, or we're in a situation where we don't feel like we could comfortably share what we want to share, what we want to communicate. One strategy in therapy that I used with some of the patients that I worked with is that every once in a while, sometimes we would do a homework assignment where they would write down what they wanted to communicate in a letter. And this was a very helpful and a very therapeutic process. And this letter, we could say it was for the person that they were writing for, but it really was for the person writing the letter. And the reason why is that it gave them the opportunity to kind of put together what they wanted to say. And it kind of gave them the opportunity to process it a little bit too. And most of the time, the person did end up giving the letter to the person that they intended to communicate with, but not always. And sometimes they sat on the letter and they just waited. But the writing the letter was very therapeutic. So especially if it was something that was a topic that was very uncomfortable to talk about, or felt very emotional to talk about. And sometimes when we're communicating verbally, which is a great way to and format to communicate, sometimes emotions can get high, and sometimes the person that's listening may not be in the same space in terms of being able to listen fully or fully pay attention, or sometimes they can get stressful. And so the letter gives space, I think, for both people, the person writing the letter and for the person receiving the letter, to kind of both process things. So I just wanted to mention that those are some ways that, to think about communicating if it's a really important topic, especially related to things in your life. Let's see, I've got some more comments on here I just wanted to read. There was someone that wanted to give some resources. So there is a voice activation software. And we have, I believe it's Regina from Canada that is, or Terry that's sharing this. But there is a voice activating software for the person that had shared that they lose their voice sometimes. And this is actually thank you for sharing that, because I know this, so I don't know why it didn't come into my mind. But there are assistive technology resources that are available if you do have trouble with your voice box that can help with communicating. And so people with ALS and people with other conditions, even Parkinson's disease, et cetera, use these type of technologies sometimes. And the technologies can be as simple as apps that are on your phone, all the way to communication devices, or even strategies to kind of help, just communicate. That's a really great thing. If you trying to think, assistive technology, depending on where you live, I would look at assistive technology for speaking, and that could probably help lead you to the right resource. Or you could contact the National MS Society and speak to an MS navigator. That would be another resource as well that I would share. So we're going to move on to our next slide. So this is just reiterating, if we don't make space for communication, how can we expect others to know what we need? I will give you a silly, kind of silly-ish example, maybe it's a serious example of communicating. So today, I was tired. I shared this early on, and I took a nap before this program this evening, so that way you could get the best of me and not the tired of me. And right before I took a nap, I sent a text to my husband and to my son, and I said, I need to rest for about an hour because I have a program tonight. Please let me rest for the hour. I didn't want them to wake me up. I didn't want them to make a lot of noise. And so that was the way of me directly communicating. We already know I have fatigue. We already know I need to nap sometimes, but that was my way of kind of protecting what I needed, which is that rest. So we're going to move on to the next slide. But I couldn't expect my family to know that if I didn't share it. They, they would come downstairs. Maybe my son would want me to make him dinner, because that would be something that I should be doing at that time. And instead, my husband picked up and managed dinner with my son. So, but they wouldn't have known to do that if I didn't communicate it. So I want us to kind of do a deep dive for a second, each of us, and think, and you don't have to put this in the question box if you don't want to share it. If you do want to share it, just to even see if other people have similar things, please share. We know that we're not alone. If you don't want me to read your name, just don't say my name. But what is something that is challenging to communicate with others? Like, what is something right now that you're kind of struggling with communicating, either related to your MS, and we'll kind of stick to MS, but something that you kind of would like to communicate that you're kind of struggling to communicate here lately? What is something, like, if you could make it easier, that you would make it easy to communicate? Okay, this is a great one. I like this one. Samadhi says, how do we convince people that quiet is so necessary sometimes? Not all the time, just those terrible times. It's really difficult to communicate that. That's a really important thing. And so what one of the things we have talked about in the past in this mental wellness chat is kind of being able to navigate what we need, right? And knowing that. And sometimes we really do need quiet time. And people are very different. People are so incredibly different. Some people get energy from more loud and more interaction, and some people get energy from quiet, and that's where I lie, is I need quiet to get more energy, and sometimes we can't expect that everybody's going to understand that you need quiet and they don't. I think it's sharing kind of what you need and being comfortable and confident with, well, that's what I need. And it's okay if you don't need that, but I need that in order to focus or in order to have more energy. And it can feel very isolating when you're centered around people there's a lot of noise, a lot of things going on that are too stimulating, and you're kind of feeling like you're not doing well, and it's hard to be in that spot. I think sometimes you don't have to convince everyone, because if they're not going to be understanding enough, then they're not. But I think sometimes it's also knowing what you need and being able to activate what you need and being confident, well, that's what I needed to do. Linda said it's hard to communicate that I can't walk as far as I used to. Thank you for sharing that, Linda. And we have Lydia, who says it's difficult to communicate my worsening of symptoms and what that feels like on the inside and out. So it sounds like it's difficult to communicate just about the symptoms and about things getting worse. Donna says, I've got to learn to slow my brain down. I just get ahead of myself when I speak. One resource I'd love to give you, Donna, and of course your comments are not I'm only giving you this feedback because I know it's a resource as a social worker, is that you can, I would highly recommend going to see a speech therapist. And just hang tight with me for a second. A speech therapist, they work a lot with people with Parkinson's disease, but speech therapists are pretty incredible because they can, a lot of speaking has to do with thinking. And what I knew when I worked within the Parkinson's program is that speech therapists were actually very helpful for people with Parkinson's disease that were having cognitive problems and having trouble thinking of things because they were getting too ahead of themselves. And so speech therapy might actually be a neat recommendation for some strategies and some tools. And I feel like they're a resource that many people don't know about from that perspective, but it is definitely, they hold some really good strategies to kind of slow yourself down and be able to speak. But I can understand one of the things I do to slow myself down is I take notes. And by taking notes, that really helps me. So then I don't feel like I have to say everything, that I can write it like a keyword down, and then that slows me down because then I know I won't forget what that keyword is. And we have Diana said, it's hard to just tell others when I've hit my wall, but things still need to be done. And that can be a challenging one, Diana. I wanted to ask Diana this, do people in your circle kind of know what your wall looks like when you hit it? Like some of my friends don't know what that looks like, but I have a couple of people that know what that looks like. And my husband and my son definitely know what that looks like because I look tired, I'm quieter, that kind of thing. Do you have people in your life that kind of know what your wall looks like? And if not, it's such a hard thing to say, but sometimes when I've hit my wall and I've extended too much, and I'm with my friends, I'll kind of say, this is kind of what it looks like. And I've got to rest, or I've got to listen to my body right now. I'm wondering what other advice you guys would have for that. Please chime in. So Kanita says, it's hard for me to get across that I have memory problems. When I forget, my housemate thinks I just don't care. So yeah, these are all really hard things to communicate, right? And can be challenging things, but looking at it or just thinking about it, if you had that one thing that was hard to communicate that was understood by some of the people that you need to understand, it would probably make things a lot easier, right? And then we have Linda that says, I have to say I'm tired out loud. I know when I'm starting to scramble my words. So you probably know, MS and your signs and kind of when its symptoms are kind of getting kind of to be too much. I think that's a very common thing, though, for many of us, is that we get to a certain point with sorry, my foot. We get to a certain point with our disease that we kind of know it and we kind of know what it's doing, and sometimes we have to find a way to mitigate. Oh, Patricia, this is very sweet. I'm going to read it only because you're making me. She said, please share. I've been watching you as well as MSU's and News webinars. This has saved me from a year ago. I'm a different person, more positive and able to use techniques to help. Thank you very much. Thank you, Patricia. That was very kind, and I appreciate that. And I think that you guys all make this incredible. Like, you have no idea. Everybody's participation makes this such a great program. And then we have Jane says, Speech Language Hearing Associates has resources, usually free, to help with communication disorders. Google ASHA. Remember that this will be video recorded and you'll be able to access it later. But remember ASHA, and there's a 1-800 number, and they have resources. So again, I'm going to say it one more time. Sorry, my nose is itching. Google A as in apple, S as in Sam, H as in house, and A as an apple again. And that is great. Thank you for sharing that resource. Okay, we're going to move on to our next slide. So open, direct communication is not selfish. It is selfless. So I want to re-encourage you. I want to just reiterate this by far, is that communicating is not selfish. Saying if you need something is not selfish. Me telling my family I needed to rest for an hour was not selfish. It was saying what I needed so I could take care of myself. And if you're in a situation where you're with a group of people and say that they are walking and they want to walk a farther distance and you can't, and you can't walk as far, it's not selfish to say, I just can't do that. I'm sorry. It's too hot outside, or I'm not feeling good. Or if you're getting tired, and say, you know, I've had groups of, you know, friends I've went out with and I've before, and they have much more energy than me. And it's not selfish to say, you know, I've enjoyed dinner, but I'm not going to go out to the next thing because I don't have the energy for that this evening. It's really helpful for yourself, and it's putting yourself first and your needs first, which is really important. So we're going to talk just a little bit about communication with our healthcare providers. We've been focusing on communication with like friends, etc. But I wanted to reiterate how important it is to communicate with our healthcare providers. You know, we have MS is like an iceberg. You've heard it from me, you've heard it from probably other presentations before, but our providers can only see so much. You know, they can only see the things that they can see, either on images through your MRIs or through visible symptoms or visible things that they can see from their eye, but they might not be able to see things like what fatigue feels like for you, or they might not be able to see mood changes. They might not be able to see that at certain points that you have trouble with your voice box, because you might be fine when you're going there, and the times that you experience it, it's not when you're around them. So it's important to communicate what is going on with your healthcare providers, and letting them know what your needs are. And even if you don't know you have a need, it is important to communicate what is in your MS iceberg, what's on the tip. You know, like they can see those things, but maybe what's some of the other things, what's on the bottom, you know, how are you doing when you're meeting with your MS specialist. It's important to kind of say, you know, if you've been dealing with any mood changes, to make note of that. If you've been you know, noticing other changes, or even quality of life changes that you think are attributed to your MS, to make sure you make space to talk about, because otherwise they're not going to know. I'm going to move on to our next slide. Okay, so I wanted to open this question up because I think it's relatively important. What tools do you use to communicate with your healthcare team? And I will get us started because it always takes a little bit for people to chime in. For myself, I use that My Chart tool, which is the electronic tool. And I think that tool's been helpful for me because I don't think it's a perfect system, and I can complain about, about sometimes the technologies, but I think it's been very effective for me because it gives me a space to kind of think of my questions, to write them out, and then I get to send them. And so that for me has been a pretty good platform, even if it's like I have questions before my appointment and I wanted to make sure my doctor knew, or if there's something I needed to report, et cetera. So that's been a tool that's been helpful. It's definitely made my communication more effective. The other thing is, I tend to make a small list before I talk with my doctor, and so that way I feel like if I just try to wing it, I forget things, and I know that's very common for many people. Let me see if anyone. So Maria said notes. Linda said email in the portal. We have. Patricia says, I learned from MSG's news. I know you can't see it, but I'm having trouble with blank, 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 and I need your help. That is great. I like that. So let me repeat that one more time because I think that's pretty powerful. So one way to explain to someone that one of your invisible symptoms, you can say, I know you don't see this, but I'm having trouble with whatever it is that you're having trouble with, your invisible symptom, and I need your help. I like it. So Kanita says, My Health Online, so it sounds like an online portal. Donna says, My Health app. Linda says, I write everything in lists from medications, physicians, surgeries, allergies, and keep the printouts with me. It helps me keep track of everything, and I also use the portals. Good. We have a lot of good organized people here. Maria said, preparing to emphasize things that maybe they've dismissed before. So if there's something that she feels like maybe has been dismissed before, that she makes space to kind of prepare to kind of really talk about and explain or get her point across about certain things. Carol says, I use notes during the year, so I'm prepared for my appointment. That is great. So you guys have a lot of really good strategies on how to communicate with your healthcare provider. And that is important. And then we have Kanita says, I also put comments in my calendar along with dates, times, and locations. And that is a great strategy too. We're going to move on to our next slide. So I want you to think about communicating effectively as a part of taking care of your mental health and your MS. So even if you're communicating about something that's not related to mental health, if you're communicating effectively with the people that love you, that care about you, and you're communicating effectively with your healthcare team, or making efforts to communicate better with both of them, you're really taking part of better care of yourself, and that's going to help your mental health. Because what happens is if we don't talk about the things that bother us, we are not able to communicate things that we have or needs that we have, then what happens is that then we hold in feelings about that, and we're not taking really good care of ourselves. And then people are not going to understand what our needs are. So it's a little bit cyclical. So thinking about communication as an act of self-care for you and for your MS. We'll go on to our next slide. So I'm going to go over a couple of barriers. I'm going to go a little bit fast because I don't want us to run out of time. And then I promised Terry that I'm going back to her question before I'm done. So barriers to effective communication. We'll move to the first slide. So things that get in the way. So stress and out of control emotions. So when your stress level is high, we don't communicate as well. It's just a natural thing. I know when my stress is high, my MS is not even that great. So, but when I'm stressed, I don't even communicate the way I would want to communicate. It might be one thing with in the community, but with my family, like I maybe would be a little bit shorter or snappy, etc. So stress and out of control emotion definitely affects how we communicate. So sometimes we need to pause a little bit, calm down, slow ourselves down, and then come back. And this can go with that feeling of teariness that was mentioned before, and that significant feeling of sadness. Like you may, that may feel like an out of control emotion in that time. And so it sounds like taking that pause and coming back, like in the example, that is very helpful. But that's a barrier to effective communication, is stress and out of control emotion. Let's move on to the next slide. Lack of focus. This really can hurt communication. I know for me, it can hurt my communication verbally if I'm delivering or communicating and I have a lot of things that are creating a distraction. And we had people talk about this earlier on today, noises, etc. And so that can really be a barrier to effective communication. Also, if the person you're talking to is looking at the television, or looking at their phone, and sometimes we can look at our phone and listen and multitask. That can be possible, but if we're not focusing in on the conversation, often that can really be a major barrier with communication. We'll move on to our next slide. Inconsistent body language can definitely make communication not as effective. So for example, if somebody gives you some information and you say that's okay, but deep down you're not okay with it, then that ruins the communication cycle. So making sure that your body language is congruent with what you're saying. And then we'll move on to our next slide. And then negative body language can be really hard with affecting communicating effectively. So that might be having your head down. It might be crossing your shoulders, arms. Kind of if you're giving, pulling away from the person, etc. Your body language can definitely halt some of communication sometimes. And spoken from the parent of a teenage son, definitely so. You can see those body language cues in a teenager very easily. We'll move on to our next slide. So we're going to talk about just a couple of hallmarks of effective communication. We'll go on to our next slide. So skill one is becoming an engaged listener. Being focused, being attentive is going to help with communication. We'll move on to the next slide. Pay attention to nonverbal signs that you're getting. So paying attention to the person that you're talking to, seeing what their body language is like, how they're responding. We'll go on to the next slide. Keeping your stress level in check. This is really important because the more emotional a conversation gets, the higher stress it gets, the less effective usually that the communication becomes. And we'll move on. Assert yourself, which means, making sure that you're communicating what you need to communicate. You might need to take a break to do that, but making sure that you are communicating. And your next one. We're going to go right past this one as well. So I'm going to reiterate again, and then I have a couple comments, and then we'll go to maybe the last couple slides. So I want to reiterate again, you are not alone. I hope that as I read your feedback and your input, that you guys that you can see your connections within each other. So I had a couple things that I wanted to answer before I get to the end of the program. So let me find it real quick. Okay. So one is we have, what do you do when you feel hopeless, helpless, and the world is a lost place? And that is a really, really tough place to be, right? If you're feeling hopeless, helpless, I want you to talk with your doctor. I want you to talk to your primary care doctor or your physician. If you're ever having thoughts or feelings of self-harm, I want you to seek emergency care. But if you're feeling a sense of hopelessness or sadness or heaviness, and you're having a sense of despair, I want you to talk with your doctor, or I want you to seek counseling. Ultimately, the goal would be to maybe get counseling and to see if there's any, this world is a challenging world, and we're not going to go there in terms of content, but it's a challenging world, and sometimes life is really hard, and while there's a lot of things that are not treatable, there might be some either resilience tools that you can learn through counseling and therapy. Definitely the MS Mental Wellness Chat does help with that some when we talk about tools. But there might be some things that you can put into place to get you some support, because while the world can be difficult and challenging and hard, and MS can be difficult and challenging and hard sometimes, quality of life is so much better when we're not stuck in that place of hopelessness. And so I want to encourage you to please reach out to your doctor or a counselor, please, and that will help. And there's nothing wrong with you in that sense. I think seeking help and just saying, you know what, things have been just very heavy and hard or very stressful, and some support would be helpful. And I think in many times we could all use support. So I just want to reiterate that. We have a couple more questions. How can I tell if I'm if out of control emotion is pseudobulbar? You will, you can talk to your doctor about it, and that would probably be able to identify. But it's a very extreme, very, very extreme response of crying uncontrollably or laughing uncontrollably. Like if you know it, you sort of know it, and if you see it, you kind of see it. So you can look it up if you want, but talk with your doctor about it. But you would probably know, because you might be crying at a time that like it feels inappropriate to be crying and laughing, vice versa. Marguerite says, thank you, I was late, but we'll listen to the recording. Marguerite, I'm so happy you're here, and please do listen to the recording. There was lots of good insight from everyone. Maddie said, thank you so much for these talks. So sweet. Maddie says, I second the counseling, especially when you find one who works with grief and loss, and that is so helpful and great advice. And the counseling should be addressing those things as well. Linda said, where does someone find a local MS counselor? What I would recommend is call the National MS Society and speak with an MS navigator. If there is a therapist that specializes in MS in your area, they will definitely connect you to them. Probably teletherapy has helped broaden that out a little bit. The other thing is that you do not have to have a specialist a counselor that specializes in MS. I think it's more important that your counselor specializes in or has some experience with chronic disease and grief. Because grief and changes and transitions. So those are the types of things I would look for in a counselor. And Patricia says, it's important to create your tribe, have a therapist, one or two close friends, church, children, spouse, etc. I call this your emotional support group, and it may be small. Mine's kind of small. Yours might be bigger, but it's so important to have your emotional support team. We have our medical teams. We should have our emotional support teams. And then Diana says, I feel disregarded when I try to explain I'm feeling tired and others say the same. That's so frustrating. And I want you to know that you are not alone with those thoughts and those feelings at all, because it is hard. It feels very dismissive when people say, oh, I get tired too. Well, it's not the same kind of tired. MS tired is not the same tired as you worked all day tired. It's not. It's a different type of tired. So, and the more education we can give is great, for you to share. Pam, it says, was late too. When is recording available? Recording will be available in a week or two. Look out for it. I will make sure that we publicize when the recording's ready, since we have a couple people talking about it. And then Patricia said, assign friends. So please don't hang up, because we're going to end in 1 second. Assign friends who want to help with like bring meals, help with groceries, help to clean your house, etc. And lots of comments tonight about just how the great input from everybody. And Samadhi, I'm so glad on your first time that this was great for you. And if you know me, and if you know this mental wellness chat, this slide has become permanently familiar for you because it's how I end every single program. But I don't like to say goodbye. I like to say see you later. And so I will see you at the next mental wellness chat. I had a fabulous time with each of you this evening. You were incredible participants, and you are what makes this special, is because you help each other know that you're not alone. I wish you well, and I'll see you next month.